To say, yeah, thank you so much for the invite tonight. Thanks for the really nice words, Kurt. Kurt's a really amazing collaborator as well. I'll just say that. Really great friend of mine. We've known each other for quite some time now. So it's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to share some of the work that I've been doing in prickly pears with you guys. So I kind of wanted to give you an overall just sort of background, a little bit of an idea of the evolutionary history of cacti in general, the evolutionary history of the prickly pears and relatives, and then go into a little bit of information about some of the prickly pears that occur in Illinois, and also some work that still needs to be done on prickly pears in the Midwest in general. Let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with cacti. Cacti are quite iconic members of flowering plants. They're known worldwide, although they're native specifically to the Americas. So they're found from Canada all the way to Patagonia. But they're, collector's items. They're plants that people really love and enjoy, but there are actually a lot of cool surprises when you really start looking into cacti as well. A lot of things that many people might not be aware of. So specifically, some of these really interesting members of cacti that have these really large, broad photosynthetic leaves, like you see here in the genera Pereschia and Leuenbergeria. You see some of those things sometimes and start scratching your head and like, really? Are those actually cacti? So for those of you that are familiar with purslane or portulaca, it's a nice edible. You would have Portulaca oleracea in Illinois. They're actually a very close relative of cacti. And so if you essentially took one of these purslanes and you stuck some spines in the axils of the leaves, you would have something that's very much like a Leuenbergeria or a Pereschia. And the interesting thing about looking at species like this with these big, broad photosynthetic leaves is if you take a look at those and their characters, so the way that they look, and then compare those with these more derived forms of cacti, such as in these groups, Opuntioideae, Majure, Cactoideae, and don't really worry too much about those names. I just want you to know that there's, a broad diversity of cacti here. With regards to their evolutionary history, it makes a lot of sense when you see these taxa with big, broad leaves and you look at their characters. So for instance, if we go through that really quickly, just to give you guys an idea of sort of the sequence of events leading to these really highly derived forms that the bulk of the talk is going to be focused on, I think it will make a little more sense to you. So if we look at taxa such as Leuenbergeria, these shrubby or tree-like taxa, they don't have any stomata on their stems, so they have no pores in their skin for gas exchange, and they have a very rapid bark formation. So instead of maintaining a green bark that could be used for photosynthesis or a green skin that could be used for photosynthesis, they cover it up really fast. So they're not really doing a lot of stem photosynthesis. So they're using their leaves to produce the bulk of their food, right? If we move up one level here and look at Pereschia, well, with Pereschia and the rest of Cactaceae, we have stem stomata that are developing. So we have, these little holes, these little pores in the skin, this green epidermis that allows for gas exchange. So it also allows for a greater efficiency in photosynthesis. Then we have a delayed bark formation. So the bark, so instead of forming bark that covers up that green epidermis, we actually have a green skin that maintains that way for sometimes 10, 20, 30 years. And so essentially we're going from something that's kind of like a typical tree and forming bark, and then we're moving into something that essentially maintains a green skin for the duration of most of the rest of its life, because we're going into this more derived form like you see in the Opuntias and other cacti and relatives, where they're using their stems for photosynthesis rather than these big broad leaves. So it's a pretty cool evolutionary pattern once you put it into sort of this tree-like perspective. So tonight I'm going to be focusing on this group called the Opuntioideae. So that's a subfamily name. Doesn't really matter, if you focus on that subfamily name or not. I just want you to realize that this is a group of very close relatives, and this group of cacti that I've been studying for quite some time now. And these include a number of things that you'll be very familiar with, such as the prickly pear cacti, which will be essentially the focus of the talk tonight. But also, if you've ever been out to Arizona, if you've ever been out to New Mexico, or maybe parts of central Mexico or Baja, you would have seen choyas. So this is the genus Cylindropuntia. Cylindropuntias are part of this Opuntioid group of cacti. And so these have cylindrical stems. A lot of people call them jumping choyas because as you're walking through a colony of these things, the stems break off pretty easily, and it's easy to flick up the stem segments from your foot onto your back or another place, and they're really hard to get off. So they're really quite nasty. But we also have these really interesting members such as Chiabintia and Prescyopsis that have these big, broad leaves that look a lot like these Prescyas and Leuenbergerias I was showing you just a second ago. So they're kind of head scratchers because they're close relatives of a group that's really highly derived. We also have species such as, or taxa such as Gonzalea that occur in the Greater and Lesser Antilles. And those occur, really phenomenally in these tropical dry forests. And so we have taxa that are occurring in tropical dry forests, taxa that are occurring in deserts, and then taxa that occur in temperate regions, so such as the cacti that occur in Illinois and eastern North America in general. We even have groups of these, such as this genus Opuntia, that occur broadly throughout parts of Andean South America, so in and around the Andes in relatively dry habitats. So this group, essentially what I'm trying to get at here is this group of Opuntias and relatives occurs pretty much anywhere throughout the Americas in relatively dry locations. So just to give you an idea of some of the principal habitats where you find most of the bulk of the diversity of these groups will obviously be the Western North American desert regions are very species rich in this group. And then also tropical dry forests throughout the Americas contain a relatively high number of these. And especially this area in southern South America called the Chaco, which is primarily in Bolivia, Argentina, parts of Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay. And all of these areas we have quite an interesting diversity of these Opuntioid taxa. So I'm really going to be focusing tonight on the Opuntias and immediate close relatives. And the way that you can tell these apart from some of the other relatives is they have stem segments that are flattened. So we oftentimes call those cladodes, but oftentimes people think of those as leaves. And they're not actually leaves, they're actually flattened photosynthetic stem segments. They essentially form the function of leaves because the leaves are very heavily reduced in these species. But whenever you see these flattened stem segments like this in a group of cacti, you're almost always looking at this group of Opuntiae. So I just kind of wanted to give you an overview of the diversity of this group and where the centers of diversity are found. So again, Southern South America and the Chaco region, there's a broad diversity of this group. Of course, Western North America, the Caribbean, Eastern Brazil, and then we have our own little, nice little radiation of species here in the southeastern United States. And then there's a smattering of species that occurs from the southeast all the way up into Canada. This group is really important ecologically. So there are a number of different taxa that still utilize this group. Just to sort of go down the list, if I went down the full list, we would be here all night because there have been an upward of 90 vertebrate species that have been recorded eating or utilizing Opuntias, prickly pears, in one way or another. But even Pleistocene megafauna were using these taxa. So the Columbian mammoth was using these, the large ground sloths that occurred in the Pleistocene. So fossilized dung from these taxa have been excavated from a number of different caves in both New Mexico, Arizona, and a number of other places, including Utah. And they found remains of prickly pears and close relatives in those remains of their fecal samples. Rabbits really love them. These are some rabbit droppings that I found with little prickly pear seeds in them. So you can see that they're eating the fruit, dispersing those around. Of course, pack rats utilize these. They feed off of them and also make a bit of their home out of the bits of spiny pieces of stem oftentimes, both prickly pears and relatives. And then there are a whole range of invertebrates that use prickly pears. And this is just one of the natives from eastern North America. It's a pyralid moth. And essentially they lay their what are called egg sticks on the spines. The eggs hatch, and then they feed on the interior portion of the stem segment and then hatch out and fly away. So they're very ecologically important. They're commercially important. Many of you who might have traveled to the desert Southwest, or maybe even you could be able to pick up the Opuntia fruit tunas or nopales in your local grocery store. These are becoming more and more and more common. Of course, in Mexico, it's very common to find these on your dinner plate, and it's becoming more and more common in other parts of the Americas and across the world as well, especially Italy. Funny enough, because they raise a lot of Opuntias there. So they're very commercially important. They have a number of medicinal properties as well. They're actually good for diabetes as well. So it's a really phenomenal group. And for those of you that like an occasional beverage, they're really great for that as well. So if you've ever tried Otra Vez, it's a pretty good beer that is developed in part from prickly pears. So they have ethnobotanical ornamental importance. This group in general does. So they're very heavily cultivated, throughout the world as ornamentals. But a really interesting story is this use of Dactylopius, this hemiperin true bug that is raised on the stem segments of prickly pears. And it actually, they incorporate the pigments inside of these prickly pears into their body. Those are picked and dried and then crushed, and they're made into this fine powder that makes this really beautiful dye that has been used to stain textiles. It's literally been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years, used by the Aztecs, the Mayas, and then it actually became worth more than its weight in gold after the Spanish conquest of Mexico. So that's a really phenomenal insect that's raised on prickly pears. Okay, when we look at a prickly pear, what exactly are we looking at? It's actually a pretty complicated structure in general. The overall structure of the plant. So essentially, instead of having a cylindrical stem section, you have a stem section that's become totally flattened. And there's probably a pretty good reason for why that evolved, which I really won't go into tonight. But so essentially, you flatten a stem segment. It would be like a typical stem segment of, let's say, a tree with alternate spiraling leaves, but then it becomes flattened. And so you get these really interesting sets of leaves that are still kind of going in a spiral if you follow them up. But it's sometimes really difficult to pick out that spiral because the stem segment has been so heavily modified. So we have the cladodes, these modified photosynthetic stem segments, and then the true leaves are these small green structures that are coming out from the side of the cladodes. And in the axils of each one of those leaves, we have this structure called an areole. So essentially that's just, so if you've ever played around with pears at all, and you see these short little nubbins of stems along the larger stem of a pear, that's called a short shoot. And in cacti, that short shoot is embedded in the larger stem. And so from that short shoot, you get these modified leaves that are produced, which are non-photosynthetic, and those are the spines, and those are the glochids. If anyone's ever played with an Opuntia, you've probably regretted it because you end up with your hands covered in these horrible little spines that fill your hands all together. And the glochids look something like this. They have these retroverse barbs. They stick in your skin. They're really horrible. The seeds in this group are really easily identified from any other group of plants because they have this really hard, bony outer covering. So it makes them really easy to pick out. So this is an evolutionary tree of prickly pears. I don't really want you guys to, focus on, trying to figure that out or anything. I just want you to pay attention to these two parts of the tree that I have illuminated there, because those are the two main groups of evolutionary units, let's say, where you actually have representatives in Illinois. So there are two principal unrelated groups where you have representatives in Illinois. Those aren't actually in this evolutionary tree, but I will be talking about those in a minute. So I just wanted you to realize that of the species you have in Illinois, they're actually not necessarily one another's closest relatives. One interesting thing about the evolutionary history of the prickly pear cacti, based on the work that we've been doing, is it's pretty clear that the group originated in southern South America and then dispersed over time, over a period of, let's say, 6 to 7 million years, into North America and to Western North America, and then from there moved into Eastern North America. So Eastern North America was kind of like the last place the prickly pears invaded during their dispersal from South to North America. So it's a really fun story. What are some of the things we know based on a number of previous studies in this group? Anyone you talk to that's ever really worked with prickly pears, one thing that they're going to mention is hybridization. So this group just kind of goes in for hybridization. They have these open, generalist, pollinated flowers, and so bees go from one species, they go to another species, they cross-pollinate those, you get hybrids. So this is just an example of a hybrid that I found in the Big Bend of Texas area. So this one in the middle is showing characters that's directly intermediate between Opuntia rufoda and macrocentra, a very clear hybrid. And there's this thing that occurs oftentimes with hybridization called polyploidy. So it's when these species duplicate their genome. So instead of having 22 chromosomes, they might have 44, or they might have 66, et cetera, et cetera. And there are lots of polyploids that are found in prickly pears because they tend to hybridize a lot. So let's jump into a few of the species that you might expect to see in Illinois. One of these is Opuntia cespitosa, and you might already be scratching your head going, wait a second, don't we have Opuntia humifusa in Illinois? I'm gonna jump into that in just a second, just to give you an idea of why I'm using the name Opuntia cespitosa. So this is actually based on work that I've done and work that was published a number of years ago. And this is essentially, I know this map is a little hard to see, but all of these points that you see in Eastern North America and Eastern US and parts of the Midwest are populations of what I call Opuntia cespitosa. So if you look at this plant, you can see that it has yellow flowers with dark red centers. And if you go back and look at and pay really close attention to Opuntia humifusa upon its original description, it was not supposed to have red-centered flowers. They were supposed to be totally yellow. And so when I started finding populations of this throughout the eastern U.S., I was really scratching my head because this looks a lot like something you would find in Texas called Opuntia macrorrhiza, but the spines aren't quite right. And so I did quite a bit of work on this, including a little bit of genetic work. And it actually appears that Opuntia cespitosa, this very wide-ranging species in the eastern U.S., is derived from hybridization with something very similar to Opuntia humifusa and Opuntia macrorrhiza from parts of western U.S. And so at some point in the distant history, probably during the Pleistocene, there was a connection between populations of humifusa and relatives in the east, and then macrorrhiza. They came together, hybridized, formed cespitosa, and then it essentially followed retreating glaciers all the way up into the upper Midwest where it can be found today. So I just wanted to give you an example of what true Opuntia humifusa looks like and the overall distribution of Opuntia humifusa. So I know this map, again, is kind of hard to see, but if you look at the stars here, you can see essentially what I'm calling the true distribution of humifusa. So it's mostly restricted to kind of like the coastal plain area and a little bit north of that into Cape Cod. And then there's this group of populations in northern Mississippi. And since the publication of this treatment of this group, there have been a couple of other populations found that are kind of starting to span this disjunction between Mississippi and these other populations to the east. But if you look at the flowers here, fully yellow flowers, so they don't have that dark red center. If you look at the stem segments, they don't have spines, so they're totally spineless. So these characters actually appear to hold up over this broad distribution as well. And they have a very, for the most part, cohesive distribution. So this is what we're calling Opuntia humifusa. I have actually seen this in Illinois, but cultivated. So the bulk of what you would see in Illinois is going to be Opuntia cespitosa. There is one population in Illinois of Opuntia fragilis. This is, one of the cutest prickly pears out there, and one of the most wide-ranging prickly pears as well. This occurs from Arizona all the way up into Alberta, Saskatchewan, and then all the way over into Ontario. So it has a very wide distribution. The population that's in Illinois is one of the southeasternmost populations of the species. This is a species that doesn't flower very often, and the stem segments break off really easily. So it's thought that this species was actually, the overall distribution of it was probably generated through migrating buffalo. So a lot of the overall distribution of this plant, because it does occur on these broad sandy soils and prairie areas, essentially where a lot of the migrating buffalo in the past, at least, would have roamed. And these are easily, the stem segments are easily stuck in buffalo's fur. There's actually a lot of record of that, especially out west. And so it seems very likely that the overall distribution of the species probably has a lot to do with traditional migration patterns for buffalo. So it's a really fascinating plant. And again, restricted to this one area in Illinois, but really fascinating plant. One of the northernmost populations of this is actually in Mount Huron in Michigan. So really, really interesting plant. But it is one to look out for while you're tromping around Illinois. It is always possible that there could be other populations of the species around that just have not been found. So Opuntia macrorrhiza has also been listed for Illinois, but it's kind of a confusing story because what is typically considered Opuntia macrorrhiza is kind of this material that you see here on the left, which is what we would typically find in places like central Texas. So it's pretty widespread in the western U.S., especially the southwestern U.S. But then there are these forms that you get through the Great Plains, and then forms that you get in the upper Midwest that look very much like Opuntia macrorrhiza. I don't know that they're truly Opuntia macrorrhiza, and I actually have an idea of why they look like macrorrhiza, but probably are not. And I'll share that with you guys in just a moment. But the interesting thing about these is so this is typical macrorrhiza here. This is more like the material that you might find in certain parts of Illinois. This is actually a photo that I took of a population in Iowa. And they have deep dark red centers, a lot like cespitosa, a lot like macrorrhiza. So I think there's something pretty interesting going on there. We have this species, Opuntia, which is called Opuntia cymochila. And this occurs broadly throughout the Great Plains. And if you look closely at the spines in this species, we have really small sort of hair-like spines towards the base that kind of deflects against the stem segment. And then we have these longer spines that are reaching out. The interesting thing about cymochila is it's derived from a couple of other species. It's a hybrid in itself, but it has been very successful. It's very widespread throughout Oklahoma, Kansas, throughout the Great Plains, up to Nebraska. Actually, this photo is cymochila from Nebraska. Here's cymochila from Oklahoma. It's really common in New Mexico, Colorado, very wide distribution, but it actually turns out that the northeastern flank of cymochila starts to get up into parts of the Midwest and parts of the upper Midwest in Minnesota. It actually seems to have come in contact with the northwestern flank of cespitosa. So that could lend some evidence to where we might have developed. Sorry, this is kind of a crazy figure here, and I'll walk you through it in just a moment. But I think that's probably where this material from the upper Midwest that looks a lot like Opuntia macrorrhiza came from. So I'm going to walk you through this kind of strange scenario I have here, and a lot of this is based on data, some of which I've published, some of which I have not published, but I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of what we're seeing in this kind of really complicated group in the eastern United States. So as I mentioned previously, Opuntia cespitosa, which I have here on the upper right, is most likely derived from a hybridization event between Opuntia macrorrhiza, that's more commonly found in the southwest, and then Opuntia humifusa relatives is what I mentioned. So there's this other thing called mesacantha in the southeast that we commonly see. And there is evidence to suggest that populations of these two during glacial and interglacial events of the Pleistocene actually came into contact with one another. And so that would have allowed those two different groups to hybridize and form something that looks very much in between macrorrhiza and mesacantha. Based on the spines look a lot like mesacantha, and the flower type looks a lot like macrorrhiza. So it seems very plausible that this is actually a hybrid derivative between the southeastern and the southwestern group. It was a very successful hybridization event. So you have this essentially population of the eastern United States, and cespitosa moves further and further north. And at some point with cespitosa, you actually hit the northeastern flank of Opuntia cymochila, as I was mentioning just a moment ago, and you actually get this secondary hybridization event leading to this taxon here, that although, regarding spine shape, regarding the production of spines, the number of spines, the way that they're produced, and the flower color look a lot like macrorrhiza, I don't think they actually are true macrorrhiza. I think it's another hybrid derivative from a secondary sort of contact zone with Opuntia cespitosa and this other thing called Opuntia cymochila, which is so common throughout the Great Plains. So it's a bit of a complicated story, but there are a couple of other things that add evidence to that, and one of those is chromosome number. So I was mentioning whole genome duplication a moment ago, polyploidy, and there's actually differences in chromosome number of a couple of these taxa that would lend a little bit of evidence to this sort of past hybridization scenario. One thing I should mention is, based on the current distribution of a lot of these different species, these hybridization events are things that probably happened, quite some time ago, and there may or may not be ongoing hybridization in many of these populations, because a lot of the populations, especially in the Midwest, are actually quite distant from one another. They were probably much more cohesive in the past, and now they seem to be much more highly fragmented, with development, and among overall changing ecological conditions as well. It's really not that common to see lots of populations sort of very close to one another. Just check the time here. Make sure I'm not going over here. So, so I think what this all means in terms of this overall hybridization scenario, and this is pretty much true for any part of the distribution of prickly pears, is there's a lot more field work and overall evolutionary phylogenetic work that needs to be done in a group. So there's been a lot of work done, based on past work that I've done on this group of eastern United States prickly pears, but there's still much more work that needs to be done, especially in the Midwest, actually. And into the Great Plains, where there's some really complicated histories underlying what we're actually seeing in the field. So, so keep your eyes out for prickly pears when you're out and about, when you're looking for other plants. One thing that's very common in this group, or I should say very uncommon, is herbarium specimens. So it's a group of plants that's very difficult in terms of the overall preparation of specimens. Most people don't like to prepare them in the first place because they're really pesky. You get stuck with spines, you get glochids stuck in your hands. They're really hard to work with. They don't make great herbarium specimens unless you take a lot of time and making those preparations for drying the specimens out correctly. So we're really missing lots and lots and lots of data from populations across Eastern North America. So we need more people out in the field doing more field work and trying to fill in some of the gaps in our knowledge of this group. And I think by doing that, we will be able to figure out some of these more complicated scenarios where we have these putative hybridization events, or at least past hybridization events. And there are likely cryptic, what we like to call cryptic species out there. So things that may look like one species or another, but they're actually derived from separate evolutionary events. And so there's probably quite a bit of that going on in prickly pears, and more of those cryptic species that actually should be recognized that aren't currently recognized, because it's just a very complicated situation to work out in this group. So that is what I had for you guys tonight. I would be more than happy to take any questions that anybody might have.